सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The Modi government has been absolutely firm in its commitment to reduce carbon emissions and to increase the share of renewable energy in India's energy mix, which is an absolutely great initiative. And towards this, it has made commitments at the various COP meetings that have happened, especially in the last COP27 meeting. It made several commitments towards its targets for 2030. Now, even on the renewable energy front, the government has made a lot of progress. Even though it's missed out on its 175 gigawatts capacity by 2022, it's made a lot of progress in increasing the renewable energy capacity in India. Now, the latest step it's taken in this regard is to issue green bonds. Now, what are green bonds? How do they work? This is what we're going to discuss in this episode of Macro Sutra. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, economy editor at ThePrint, and we have with us, as always, Radhika Pandey, who's senior fellow at NIPFP. Thank you so much, Radhika, for joining us.
Sharad.
Now, at the very basic, let's try to explain what are green bonds and how do they work.
So green bonds are just like any other bond, but the difference with green bond is that the proceeds or the finance, the funds that are raised through the issue of green bond, they have a specified purpose. And the purpose is that they will be used for reducing the carbon footprint of the economy, or they will be reduced in projects that are more environmental friendly, like they will be used for investment in renewable energy projects, wind, solar energy, hydropower, anything that helps in reducing our reliance on fossil fuel and help in fostering towards a greener economy. Funds raised through those kinds of bonds are called green bonds, as the name suggests. So it is like any other bond, and this bond can be issued by either government or by company or by a bank, by any financial institution. But the key difference is that the proceeds or the end use of this bond is very much specified, that it will be used for some specified purposes only. So that is a green bond.
So now, how exactly then is a green bond different from any other sovereign bond that India might issue?
Yeah, so we know that government issues, in India's case, government issues bonds to meet its fiscal deficit. For example, in 22-23, the market borrowing is around 14 lakh crore. Now, out of which some amount, as you mentioned, that in the budget, the government is going to raise some amount of this borrowing in the form of green bond. Right. So the difference is that this bond will also have a price. It will also offer some interest to its investors, but given that it has a noble cause and it's going to lead to a larger environmental benefits, what normally happens is that it attracts a diversified set of investors. The kind of investors that you normally see for a usual bond or a sovereign or a government bond, you will find a different set of investors who have some green mandate. For example, particularly in Europe and other countries, now we have such dedicated funds, green funds, whose purpose is only to invest in environmental friendly projects or those projects that are helping in reducing the reliance on fossil fuels, moving towards non-fossil fuel, moving towards achieving the net zero target that we have fixed for India's economy, moving towards COP27 targets. So all these things, there are some dedicated investor base who are only looking for not investing in projects that will harm the environment, but will invest only those projects which are more environment friendly. So normally what happens is that these kind of bonds, the green bond, will reduce the cost of borrowing, because you are able to issue these bonds at a lower interest rate. because there's a diversified set of investors who are new set of investors. They are looking for such bond, so they are okay with even a lower interest rate, which is what is called as a premium on green bond or greenium. So that is the key difference between a sovereign bond and a green bond, that typically a green bond will lead to cost saving of some basis points of interest rate. It may be 10 basis points, 20 basis points, also depending on who is the issuer. If you've already issued several tranches of green bond and you have shown your commitment towards a greener economy, then bonds will be issued at an even lower cost. Okay. For India, it is a maiden issue. Maybe the premium would be lower, but going forward, given the success of this bond issuance, if it is successful, then successive issues will lead to lower costs. So that is what is the greenium part.
Right. So now let's come at this from two different angles. One is, what all can the proceeds from green bonds be used for? Are there some rules that the government has come out with? And two, who all can invest in green bonds?
Let's look at the timeline. 22-23 in the budget, the finance minister announced that some part of the borrowing will be met through green bond. Then in November 2022, the government of India came up with a green bonds framework. Now it's a very useful document that provides the overarching objective of green bond, the projects or the kind of broad projects in which the green bonds proceeds will be invested in, who will determine what are the eligible projects. Right. So for that, they have set up something called a Green Finance Working Committee under the chairmanship of Chief Economic Advisor, with some environmental specialists from Niti Aayog, representatives from Ministry of Environment, representatives from Ministry of Renewable Energy, and so on. So this committee will evaluate and select projects in which the finance which is raised from the issue of green bonds will be invested in. So that is the second part. The third is also there are some accountability mechanisms that are put in place because that is very important. Investors need to know where you are investing. Are there some accountability measures? So there is something called a reporting requirement that this working committee, under the supervision of this committee, an annual report has to be released, which will tell us the description of projects, in which projects the funds have been invested, because it is envisaged that within 2 years of raising funds, like on 25th January, if the funds are raised, within 2 years of that, those funds have to be allocated to the eligible projects. So what are those projects? What is the description? What are some performance metrics that is expected of those projects? They have given all of these in what is termed as the framework document, because what is important is that there's no legally binding framework. So what happens is that whenever a country comes up with this kind of a bond issuance, they follow some voluntary principles, and those voluntary principles are laid down by International Capital Market Association. Okay, so it's called the ICMA, Global Bond Principle. They just give some best practice guidelines on issuance of green bond. And our framework also, the Indian government's framework on green bond, also follows those set of principles.
Okay. And so now you'd mentioned earlier, but it's not only the government of India that can issue these bonds. It's everybody, basically companies. Yes. Can state governments also issue?
State governments have to take permission, but as part of their debt management strategy, they can also invest. In fact, they will be incentivized to invest if the central government is able to command or reap a good greenium or the premium that we've talked about. But if we look at the trajectory and the path of evolution of this green bonds framework worldwide, it started with companies, and the first issue was made somewhere in 2007 by European Investment Bank. That was the first issue of green bond ever. Right. And since then we have seen green bond issuances. In India, the first issue was by Yes Bank. It was done in 2015, and And since then, many companies, financial institutions have been issuing green bonds. Adani Renewables has issued green bond. Now, ABG Group is suggesting that they are also going to join this race of issuing green bond. So typically in India, we don't have such dedicated funds. So what happens is that Yes Bank, when Yes Bank issued green bond, it was a masala green bond. Okay. So masala green bonds, as we know, masala bonds are offshore issuances. Right. They are rupee denominated, local currency denominated bonds, but they are issued offshore because it is envisaged that there is a greater demand for such kind of proceeds or such kind of objectives abroad. Right. So typically whatever kind green bond issuances we have seen in India, they have all been issued offshore. Yes Bank issued green bond to IFC. IFC is International Finance Corporation, the private sector wing of the World Bank. And then the World Bank, the IFC on behalf of Yes Bank issued these bonds in the London Stock Exchange. That gave a lot of visibility to the bonds issued by Yes Bank, and then they did 3 tranches of such green bonds. So Yes Bank did 3 tranches of such bonds. So that is companies. And then in terms of sovereigns, they were late in joining this issuances, but the first country was Poland. Poland did in 2016, closely followed by France. And since then, we've seen a lot of countries doing these issuances. Around 25 countries have already issued sovereign green bonds, while companies and non-sovereign bonds have already been prevalent, but now governments have also started doing, and they are issuing, and it's leading to, it gives a positive signal to investors that the government is committed towards a greener transition. So it also helps in offering to private investors a greater recourse to green bonds.
Right. So now you mentioned that India has been a little late on the scene. Now, is it because we were waiting for some sort of proof of concept? We were trying to see if it's successful worldwide, and only then would we join it? And it has been successful worldwide, I'm assuming.
Yeah. So we have now joined because, as you rightly pointed out, India has very ambitious targets or commitments for a green transition. We know as part of the nationally determined contribution, commitments made under COP26, then Panchamrit, COP27, where we are talking about moving to a net zero by 2070. We are reducing our emission intensity of the economy by 45% by 2030 as compared to 2005. So all these requires access to finance. You cannot have these transitions without access to finance. And India has been voicing this concern that, developed countries need to provide more finance. Okay. And one of this, a move towards this to gain greater access to finance is also the issuance of sovereign green bond, which gives a very clear positive signal to institutional investors worldwide that yes, India is serious about moving towards fast tracking its commitments towards a greener economy. Right. So that is why it's all the more necessary now, and given that India has assumed G20 presidency, again, very positive signal, giving credibility in the field of green finance ecosystem that yes, it's not only that companies are doing, but the government is also being instrumental in providing finance and allocating them towards greener projects.
And now, before we go into this issuance by the government, just to look at who can buy green bonds. I mean, can you and I buy one of these bonds, whether it's issued by a company or whether the sovereign, or is it restricted only to companies? And can foreign companies and maybe even governments invest in these?
Yes, so it's open to all, and in fact, if we look at the RBI's documentation on that, RBI has actually reduced all kind of restrictions for foreign investors, because we know typically that foreign investors' investment in government bonds are subject to certain controls. Right. There are certain restrictions as to how much a particular foreign investor or foreign portfolio investor can invest in government bonds. But for green bonds, all those limits and restrictions have been removed. So any amount out of the 16,000 crore. We know that 16,000 crore is being raised in two tranches, 8,000 crore on 25 Jan and then another 8,000 crore on 9th of Feb. So any amount can be invested by a foreign portfolio investor if that investor is registered with SEBI. Banks, institutional investors, mutual funds, insurance companies, investors, we can also invest, but how much we will invest, it will be a very small part. The lion's share, the bulk of the investment is expected to come only from institutional investors and particularly from foreign institutional investors who have a green mandate. Because in India, till now, we do not have such dedicated green funds. We do not have dedicated mutual funds or dedicated pension funds for investing in green bonds. So while the regulators are sensitizing banks, insurance companies, encouraging them to invest in green bonds, typically more demand will be from foreign investors.
Right. And now coming to this, the issuance by the government of India, as you mentioned, there are two tranches. So it'll be 8,000 crore and 8,000 crore in divided into two?
Yes. And then for each tranche of 8,000 crore, they are issuing two bonds, one with a 5-year tenor and one with a 10-year tenor. That is on 25 January and then on 9th Feb also they are going to issue that. And this entire framework has been vetted by agency, an independent agency, because that lends credibility to the framework, that somebody, an external party reviewer has reviewed the framework and certified that yes, it is aligned with globally accepted principles.
Right. And now a question for any investor, if they're especially doing it in something like green bonds, is how do you ensure that the proceeds from green bonds go towards green projects? Yes. Because now when it comes to things like collecting cesses, yes, the law says that if a government collects a cess for a purpose, like say the education cess, it has to go towards education. But is there some sort of framework like this for green bonds?
Yes. So, those are the kind of checks and balances that are put forward through the Green Bonds Framework document, and the fact that it is reviewed by an independent agency, and that independent agency's review is also available in public domain. Right. So now in terms of its rating, it has given a rating of good to India's Green Bond Framework, not excellent. So there are three, this rating framework. So that is one. And also they have something called a shading methodology. Dark green, medium green and light green. Okay. Dark green mean that it fully concurs with the principle. It is all actually green. There is no risk of, say, greenwashing, right, where you are actually saying that, okay, we are going to invest in green projects, but actually it may not be green. So that is called greenwashing. So for some sectors, the list of eligible projects or the areas where green bonds proceeds are envisaged to be invested, for some of those, the agency has given a rating of dark green, which is excellent. But on some, they have given the rating of medium green and light green, where they have raised concern that, okay, you are saying it is green, but maybe you need to define it more clearly. That is one. And secondly, you may need to specify the performance metric more clearly. So those are the steps that need to be taken to make the Green Bonds Framework more attractive, to fully comply with such definitions and disclosures. And there are such globally accepted definitions and disclosures like the Climate Bonds Initiative. They give a guidepost on what is green, what is non-green, what could be green if you specify it more correctly. For example, in India's case, the framework also classifies CNG transportation as green. I see. Now, that has caused red flags. The agency, the external agency, has raised red flags on that.
Or green flags.
Yes, so that may not, green flag. So that may not be, that is given a light green rating, okay, not a dark green. So there are some, similarly within wastewater conservation, there are some areas that, you need to, it's very general, it's very broad. You need to specify more clearly and more precisely. So when you get back to these, that will further enhance the investor attractiveness. For most of the sectors, we have dark green, but on some, there are some gray areas which further require more precision and more specific definition. And once, if those can also be done, it will further enhance participation. But as a first maiden issue, the government should focus on those sectors which are been ranked as dark green.
As dark green, right. Now, historically, India's bond market, the commentary is that it's not very deep. It's quite shallow. There's not a lot of investor interest in bonds issued in India. So how do you think that the government can go about improving this or increasing investor interest in these green bonds that it's issuing?
So, given that it is a green bond, in principle, it should attract a wider set of investors. We have seen some Canadian pension funds showing interest in India's green story. So there are these positive points.
And those are very big investors.
Very, very big investors. And their mandate is only to invest in emerging economies, green projects. So that is, and they have to report that in their reporting framework that, we are investing in these green projects which actually require transition.
And because they're pension funds, they have to be extremely safe investments. So if they're deciding to put their money, that means that the investment is a safe one.
Yes, and plus it's a long-term asset liability structure. So they are happy to put their money for long-term projects which are green projects. So that is there. But what could be done? One is that, we are talking in the bonds framework also, we are talking about PDMC, the Public Debt Management Cell. Right. Okay, so now that is in any country's sovereign bonds framework that we look at, the country's debt management agency plays a very important role, because you need to engage with investors, you need to talk to investors, you need to advertise that we are going to do this, and we are fully compliant with all globally accepted taxonomy and principles. So it requires a lot of investor interaction. It also requires a skill set to decide whether you're going to issue onshore or offshore, whether it's more easier to issue offshore like the masala bond, in which currency. So all this expertise comes if we have a specialized debt management agency. So we do have a public debt management cell, which is an interim body. So maybe this is also a time, taking this peg, it's also a time to give it more powers, to take steps to make it more statutory, because given now we need to manage a diversified set of investors, we need to come up with debt management strategies, we need to come up with annual reports on how these funds have been monitored, what we have done with the unutilized funds. We need to become more transparent, because we need to show our compliance with globally accepted taxonomy of green frameworks. So it may be time to move towards making the debt management agency a statutory body, and also taking steps to make the bond market more liquid. Primary market is good. Secondary market, as the issues have been raised, is that it's not that liquid. 75% of trading takes place in first 5 or 6 bonds only, and then the trading is very dry. So all those things need to be worked on, so that green bonds also are able to gain from a liquid market. Because green bonds, as of now, it's a very small amount. It's 16,000 crores, 8,000 crores. It may not have a very liquid secondary market, but if we make steps towards making it a liquid market, a bond market as it is, then the green bonds will also benefit, and there would be greater liquidity and tradability for such bonds. So compliance with global taxonomy, making the bond market liquid, dealing with investors, all these steps will make the green bonds framework more attractive, and the government can come up with a greater proportion. For example, currently only 1% of our total borrowing program is being issued through green bonds. So going forward, we can do more.
Right. So I actually can't improve on that as a conclusion to our discussion. It encapsulates exactly what green bonds are and how the government can go about improving the green bond system in India. But right now, the first tranche on the 25th of January is set for 8,000 crore, and there'll be another in early Feb. And so here's wishing the government all the best. Thank you so much for joining us.